Good morning. Now that we have invited the bell 5 times for our 5 congregations, welcome to the annual Hudson-Mohawk Cluster Worship Service. We gather this morning on the lands of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or the Six Nations, specifically the Mohawk, or the Kanyankehapa, the people of the Flint. As we gather on this spring day, let us vow to care for the earth and remember the lineages of stewards of these lands and be part of that lineage. I am the Reverend Wendy Bartell. Please use my name rather than pronouns when referring to me in the third person. He, she, and singular they are simply not a good fit for my gender identity. I am one of the co-ministers here at UU Schenectady, along with Reverend Lynn Gardner. She and they are pronouns are good there. And we are just thrilled to be hosting this UU gathering of this cluster, as well as in our Zoom sanctuary extension. For several years now, 5 local UU congregations have come together in the spring to have a worship service together. Albany, Glens Falls, Kingston Catskills, Saratoga Springs, and Schenectady. If you are a visitor here for the first time, we offer you an especially warm welcome and hope that you find here nourishing spiritual home and kind and compassionate people from all over, because people in this room and on Zoom are from all over the region. We're so glad that you are here.
I'm the Reverend Lynn Ashley. My pronouns are she and her. I'm serving with the Reverend Linda Hottie. Her pronouns are she and her, as one of the interim ministers at Albany Unitarian Universalist. After the service today, for those gathered here in person, there will be a social hour. For this gathering offers an opportunity for each of us to connect with other UUs who are working on behalf of climate justice, housing, criminal justice reform, medical aid in dying, and UU the Vote. It has been a tradition for these cluster services to invite a leader in our faith to share wisdom and insights. This year, when we ministers gathered to think about this service, we spoke of the challenges our congregations are facing, the challenges to people who are transgender or otherwise beyond the binary, the challenges we all are facing with the many threats to the climate, to the earth, the challenges to otherwise beyond the binary, to people of color, to our democracy. And so for today's service, we invited the program manager of our state advocacy network, New York UU Justice, known in short as NYUUJ. Reverend Ashley DeTar Birt, she, her pronouns, is ordained as a Presbyterian minister. Ashley has been an outspoken advocate for youth ministry and social justice. Reverend Ashley has been a youth leader, a children, youth, and family pastor, as well as an artistic and justice minister. She lives in New York City with her wife, Emily, who is an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister serving in North Westchester. Will you please give Ashley a warm welcome?
We gather together to be nourished, to be inspired, to lean into instead of away from the discomfort that change sometimes brings and which we also know is often necessary. We acknowledge that each of our congregations have our own unique worship cultures and our own relationships to faithful justice work grounded in our beloved Unitarian Universalism. Let us cherish the places where we are similar. Let us invest in curiosity in the places where we are different. And let us be open-hearted to the good words and good works of Reverend Ashley and all of our worship participants today. And let us give one another grace as we endeavor to do something we have never done before today. Yes, we have never done this exact thing before with these exact people at this exact moment, feeling and knowing what we know right now. This has never happened before, and that is amazing. What a profound gift it is to gather in religious community with one another. And with that, let us receive the gift of our next breath. Breathing in love, perhaps, and breathing out peace. And breathing in love, and breathing out peace. That we might be part of a great wave of compassion to ease the suffering of so many here and beyond these walls.
We have 3 short readings this morning. The first is from Audre Lorde. Without community, there is no liberation, only the most vulnerable and temporary armistice between an individual and her oppression. But community must not mean a shedding of our differences, nor the pathetic pretense that these differences do not exist.
The second is from Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman. There are 2 questions we must ask ourselves. The first is, where am I going? And the second is, who will go with me? If you ever get these questions in the wrong order, you're in trouble.
Our third quote is from poet Nikki Giovanni. The world is not a pleasant place to be without someone to hold and be held by.
As mentioned before, I am not from Central New York. I currently live in the Bronx in New York City. But the last time that I was up in this part of the state, it was for a day trip to Albany. Release Aging People in Prison, also known as RAP, had scheduled a variety of advocacy days organized by geographical region. So there was one for folks who lived in Brooklyn, one for folks in the Hudson Valley. You get the idea. As a resident of the Bronx, I waited until our day had arrived to head up with them. I am not a morning person, but I still stumbled out of bed while it was dark to make my way to the meetup spot so we could drive all the way up to the Capitol in a van together. And there are a few things I remember from that trip. One, once I was in said van, I don't think I've ever fallen asleep that quickly in my life. Two, as I drifted to sleep and woke up and fell asleep again, I heard people talking to each other, laughing with each other, learning about each other. Some people knew each other and some didn't, but all were friendly and very kind. Some even shared homemade treats. 3, people of different races and faiths and backgrounds, and even from different parts of the Bronx, had decided to advocate on that day. And 4, we weren't the only ones advocating for something that day. In fact, we weren't even the only ones advocating for a cause that New York Unitarian Universalist Justice works on. As we made our way up the stairs and through the hallways, I saw a number of yellow shirts, like that one. Holding signs in support of medical aid in dying. And each time I passed them, I nodded, smiled, and gave them a thumbs up. And they smiled and nodded in appreciation. And then there were times when others, maybe from medical aid in dying, for teachers, whatever the cause, they looked at us and did the same. So this image, this story, completely embodies for me what it means to do faithful and faith-filled justice work. As the program manager for NYUUJ, a significant amount of my job is to educate and work on justice issues that UUs in this state have identified as important. And to remind you, we currently focus on climate justice, medical aid in dying, criminal justice reform, and housing justice. But even more so, my call, and really the call for all of us, is to seek community with one another, to lift up the humanity in one another, and to recognize the way our lives connect us to one another. By seeking justice, we both bear witness to each other's stories and come together, united in one big story. Speaking of which, I think it's time. Yes, let's get ready for story time. Yes, that's better. So the readings that we heard today are all from the beginning of a chapter called Belonging in Cole Arthur Riley's book, Black Liturgies. Now, in her work, Riley often lifts up the voices of those who came before her and those with us now to create a mosaic of healing, informative, inspirational, and transcendent prayer. And each quote gives us some insight into what it means to be community, to be a group of different people uniting in faith and liberation. Each one leaves space for us to consider the many ways that people come together. And so we start with, without community, there is no liberation. Only the most vulnerable and temporary armistice between an individual and her oppression. But community must not mean a shedding of our differences, nor the pathetic pretense that these differences do not exist. If we want to create a truly equitable world in which all are seen and everyone gets what they need, it behooves us to do this together. But contrary to what some might have us believe, change doesn't happen because of one miraculous or brilliant person. It happens when many of us decide to come and work in community with one another. And at the same time, it can be very tempting to focus on our commonalities. After all, why would we dwell on the differences? We need to focus on the things that we have in common because that's how we stay positive, right? Definitely not. In fact, when we force ourselves to prioritize sameness over difference, not only do we deny the full humanity of those we seek to be in relationship with, we do our own justice work a true disservice. Hear these few stories from the current climate justice struggle. There's Marisha Catino, a student at SUNY Portland who developed COPD from coal dust that she was exposed to when her grandfather couldn't afford to pay his electric bill. There's Jeff Porter and Mohammed Saidullah, a pastor and an imam, respectively, who live in Queens and whose faithful work for climate justice happens in a place that is still reeling from multiple hurricanes and flooding. There's Bob Cohen, policy director at Citizen Action of New York, who speaks up against the Sheridan Avenue steam plant due to decades, over a century, of polluting the low-income communities of color. These people are from different places, different racial backgrounds, religious backgrounds, genders, ages, and yet they're all part of the tapestry that makes up the climate justice movement in our state. And while they're part of something that is bigger than themselves, it is their specific circumstances and identities that bring them to the work. And similarly, the medical aid in dying movement has also brought people together across backgrounds. And while you may not expect something like being able to choose for our lives to end with dignity to be filled with diversity, you'd be surprised. Consider Myra Schulman, whose mother Beverly, a white former educator and museum worker, went on countless road trips with her family between her diagnosis of terminal colon cancer and choosing to pass away in her California home on her own terms with her family by her side. There's Jean Hughes, who was a white disability activist and declared, "My life's value cannot be diminished by medical aid in dying, but to the contrary, my life would be empowered by the passage of the Medical Aid in Dying Act." Or how about Anthony Randolph, a Black New Yorker who came to support the Medical Aid in Dying Act after seeing his Marine brother's agonizing death and thinking, it didn't have to be like that. While they've all reached the same point, their journeys were specific to their circumstances. They're all part of one community, but the perspectives that they bring to that community are rich and varied. And by lifting them up, both the community and the cause become stronger. But before we go too far, let us not forget the words of Howard Thurman and his wisdom. There are two questions that we must ask ourselves. The first is, where am I going? And the second is, who will go with me? If you ever get these questions in the wrong order, you are in trouble. It seems coming together isn't the only thing that we need to do. In fact, sometimes before that, we need to consider what needs need to be addressed and whose voices are most vital to listen to. Being in community often means not just working towards something, but listening to those most impacted by that something, even if their ideas and approaches differ from ours. And this can be hard. After all, if our voices aren't being centered, then what's our role? You consider the story of Stanley Jamal Bellamy. At 23 years old, Jamal entered the prison system to serve a 62.5-year to life sentence. Do we understand what that means? For actions Jamal took at the age of 23, he was set to die by incarceration. Most incarcerated people don't live past their 60s in prison. But meanwhile, Jamal occupied his time by leading social awareness groups and developing and leading therapeutic programs to help others understand the impact of their actions. He got an education. He joined the struggle to end death by incarceration. And he even helped draft resentencing bills while working on criminal and social justice issues that directly affect marginalized groups and people of color. And on April 24th, 2023, after 37.5 years, Jamal walked out of prison a free man, having finally received clemency from the governor. He walked out a different man than he was at 23, one who was finally being seen not for what he had done, but for who he currently was. And he also walked out of those gates to a community, with leaders from the RAP campaign waiting right there for him. And within months, he became a community organizer for RAP, traveling across the country and even the world, going as far as Geneva, Switzerland, to advocate for an end to death by incarceration. And he continues to this day to push for things like the elder parole bill, which would grant parole opportunities for folks over 55, and the fair and timely parole bill, which would have parole eligible people seen for who they are today instead of the one thing that they are unable to change, which is what landed them in prison. In fact, he was at that Bronx Day with me. And the reason that he is able to do these things is because he is part of a community that, while diverse, puts those affected by incarceration, the people in prison and their families, at the forefront. The people most impacted, like Jamal, are the ones leading the work. This doesn't mean that there isn't a place for everyone in that work, but it simply lifts up those most familiar with the issues so that they can let us know what directions we need to be moving in. And finally, we have the sweet poetry from Nikki Giovanni. The world is not a pleasant place to be without someone to hold and be held by. This is what it comes down to, right? Doing justice, being in community, they're both about all of us finding ways to hold each other and to be held by each other. This isn't something we do unilaterally. It isn't something we do alone. And so with that in mind, perhaps it's time I share with you a bit of my own story. On the day I got engaged, I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in the Bronx with my now wife. Well, we were excited to start our lives together. For a long time, it was just that. Our lives. Just the two of us. My old building had a lot of different people in it. People of different ages, races, professions, nations of origin, sexual identities. But they weren't people we knew very well. Hello, in the elevator was about as much interaction as we'd expect most of the time. And for all the people it had, our building also had a lot of problems. Leaky ceilings. We had warped floors, flickering lights, unreliable heat, and other things I'll spare you from. We would contact the rental office and they would send maintenance and things would be fine until they weren't. And not only that, they began construction on the school below us with literally no warning, not even a posted sign. My wife and I attempted to deal with all that alone. What else could we do? When then the pandemic started and we had to quarantine, and we and our neighbors came face to face with these realities every second of every day. Some people had mold. Others had their ceilings literally fall through. Some just couldn't work through the day with all of that noise. We realized we couldn't take it any longer and that something had to change. And so my wife and I started talking more to our neighbors the best we could at that time. We formed a group chat, and that became a tenants association to seek changes in the building. We were somewhat successful. Things did get better, but not without some major pushback. The landlord refused to renew our lease. This time, though, we weren't trying to figure it out alone. A neighbor helped us get a lawyer at a discounted price. Another did research into what our rights were, and others were just present, there to make space and hold us in our time of need. And as other issues, including other potential evictions, arose, we were all able to hold each other as a community, including learning how we could express support for things like the good cause eviction bill which is being debated literally right now, that could have prevented our landlord from retaliating against us in the first place. These truly difficult circumstances became easier because we were all holding each other through them. This is what community does. Community allows us to come together not only across differences, but in honor of them. Community allows us to step up and step back as we address specific needs. Community allows us to hold and be held so that no one has to go at it alone. When we become community, true justice and equity and liberation are possible. It's why initiatives like UU the Vote, things that connect UUs around the country to help change our world through our collective voting power, are so meaningful and indeed have so much power. And it's why bills such as the New York Equal Rights Amendment, which will protect against currently legal discrimination, and that's coming up for a vote in November. It's why things like that matter. These are just some of the ways that we can be in community, some of the ways we can unite our stories into one larger story, made of many parts, full of hope and possibility. Let us come together, fully individual, fully united, and see where our story can take us. Blessed be. Ashe. Amen. My friends, I invite you now to take a breath in and let it out. Feel the presence of those around you. Bear witness to them in whatever ways make sense for you. Take a breath in and let it out. Let us take a moment to be present with one another, to be open and honest, and to listen. I want you to think of something you like, something that would make your life easier, or that could put a smile on your face. Not something your life would be terrible without, but something that would make it a bit brighter. Take a second. When you come up with something, feel free to say it out loud, but also make sure that when you are not speaking, you are listening for what others are saying. Friends, what's something you would like? Chocolate ice cream. Swimming. Hot pepper sauce. Naps. Peace on earth. Very nice. That's a great place to go to our next part. Now, friends, think of something you need. Something that would make your life, your world, and the world around you more just and equitable. Hang on. Take a second. And yes, when you can definitely say it out loud, but also make sure you are listening for what others are saying. Friends, what do you need? Clean water, patience. Mm.
Inspiration.
From healthcare to housing, gun control to collaboration, safety, music, community, from swimming to hot sauce to chocolate. There are so many things that we want and we need. And this is why it is important to take time to speak and be honest and vulnerable, but also to listen, to be present with one another so that you indeed can hold each other and be held, that you can come together in your individuality and work on things bigger than yourselves. Find out what you have in common, but also lift up those specificities so that things become more equitable and just. And so may you take this moment and many more after it to hear each other, to learn from each other, to speak to one another, so that you may find the way to go and who may go with you. Blessed be Ashe. Amen.